Sierra Leone formally achieved its independence from Britain and became a member of the Commonwealth of Nations on April 27, 1961, with Sir Milton Margai as its first Prime Minister. In May 1962, Sierra Leone held its first general election as an independent nation. The Sierra Leone People's Party, SLPP, which was formed in 1951 as the first indigenous political party in the country, won plurality of seats in parliament, and Sir Milton Margai was re-elected as Prime Minister. The All People's Congress, APC, which was founded in 1960 as a breakaway from the SLPP, came second by winning 16 seats in the National Assembly. The APC became the main opposition party in the country. The years just after independence were prosperous, with money from mineral resources being used for development. Sir Milton Margai was very popular among Sierra Leoneans during his time in power. His government was based on the rule of law and the notion of separation of powers, with multi-party political institutions and fairly viable representative structures. When Margai became Prime Minister, he left control of the Sierra Leonean National Army in the hands of the British. Slowly, Margai gave more control of the army over to Sierra Leoneans. Sir Milton Margai died in April 1964, and upon his death in 1964, his half-brother, Sir Albert Margai, was appointed as Prime Minister by Parliament. Unlike his late brother Sir Milton, Sir Albert Margai proved unpopular and resorted to increasingly authoritarian actions in response to protests, including the enactment of several laws against the opposition All People's Congress, APC, and an unsuccessful attempt to establish a one-party state. He was highly criticized during his tenure. He was accused of corruption and of a policy of affirmative action in favor of the Mende tribe. Albert Margai promoted many well-educated men to important civil service positions. Albert Margai took power and sought to make the army homogeneously Mende. Under his leadership, the proportion of Mende officers in the army increased from 26% of the African officers in mid-1964 to 52% by mid-1967. Of the 17 cadets who graduated from the Bengema Military Academy in April 1967, 13 belonged to the Mende ethnic group. When the last British Army commander of Sierra Leone, Brigadier Blackie, was about to step down as force commander in 1964, an army officer, John Amadou Bangura, Sierra Leone's first Sandhurst graduate and the 27th West African to be commissioned in the West African Frontier Force, was recommended to replace the departing British general officer commanding, but Albert Margai appointed Lieutenant Colonel David Lansana, a Mende by tribe, to succeed Brigadier Blackie as force commander. Lieutenant David Lansana became acting force commander in 1964 and was promoted to full colonel, and in January 1965, he was elevated to the rank of brigadier and confirmed in his new position as force commander, replacing the British Brigadier Blackie, who became an advisor to the new head of the army. John Amadou Bangura was made deputy force commander. It is also important to note that under Albert Margai, Sierra Leone enjoyed freedom of speech and free press. He tolerated criticism of his government even by political opponents. Not a single politician or journalist was killed during his time in office. Under Albert Margai, all Sierra Leoneans had access to free and fair trial. Some people believe that Albert Margai had the opportunity to perpetuate himself in power, but he elected not to do so even when the opportunities presented themselves. He had the police and the army on his side, and nothing could have prevented him from achieving his ambition to hold on to power, but he chose not to and called for free and fair elections. Albert Margai also took a lively interest in the organization of African unity. Within 2 years of taking office, his image in the international arena became brighter and was on other publications home held Albert Margai of Africa. Sierra Leone held its second election as an independent nation in March 1967. However, close to the elections, the deputy force commander John Amadou Bangura, who had attained the rank of a colonel, was implicated in a coup plot. Prime Minister Albert Margai announced that he and his administration had discovered a coup plot against the government in which the deputy force commander, Colonel John Amadou Bangura, was named as leader of the coup. Together with some junior officers, mostly from the northern part of the country, the deputy force commander, Colonel John Amadou Bangura, along with his fellow suspects, were arrested and detained at the Pademba Road prison in Freetown pending the outcome of the elections. The case, however, against them never materialized. As the SLPP lost power in 1967, The 1967 elections were held as scheduled on the 17th March, and the All People's Congress (APC) narrowly won a small majority of seats in parliament over the Sierra Leone People's Party (SLPP), and the leader of the APC, Siaka Stevens, was sworn in as the third Prime Minister of independent Sierra Leone on 21 March 1967 in Freetown. Within hours of taking office, Siaka Stevens was ousted in a bloodless military coup led by the army commander, Brigadier David Lansana, a close ally of Sir Albert Margai, who had appointed him to the position in 1964. Siaka Stevens and the Governor-General were placed under arrest by the then ADC to the Governor-General Lieutenant Samuel Hinga Norman, who was acting on the orders of the force commander on what Siaka Stevens claimed were the orders of Sir Albert Margai. At about 5:55 p.m. on the same day, Brigadier David Lansana announced to the nation that the appointment of Siaka Stevens as Prime Minister was unconstitutional since elections for 12 paramount chiefs had not yet been concluded. However, it must be said that paramount chiefs who could be deposed by the central authorities always supported the party that had the majority seats in parliament. In other words, they always supported the government of the day. Troops were then sent to disperse the crowd who thronged around the State House in readiness to celebrate the appointment of Siaka Stevens. Some of the crowd, angered by the force commander's intervention and fearing that the force commander wished to abduct Siaka Stevens and his men, blocked the main roads throughout the city. Brigadier David Lansana declared martial law after some 40 individuals were killed during demonstrations against the military rebellion. Brigadier David Lansana was himself overthrown in a counter-military coup led by Major Augustine Charles Blake, Major Sandy Bokari Jumu, and Major Bokari Idrissa Kai Samba on March 23, 1967. Brigadier David Lansana and Albert Margai were both arrested and detained. Thus, Brigadier David Lansana's brief rule was brought to an end. Major Augustine Charles Blake and his fellow officers formed a junta and established the National Reformation Council, NRC. Initially, the NRC announced that its leader would be Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Genda, who at the time was the country's second secretary at the United Nations in New York. Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Genda was reportedly posted abroad because former Prime Minister Albert Margai wanted him out of the way. However, within hours, Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Genda was replaced as leader of the NRC, and subsequently Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Juxon Smith, who was abroad attending a British military staff school when the coup took place, was asked to return and head the NRC military regime. The NRC dissolved political parties and suspended the constitution. Colonel John Amadou Bangura, who was in prison where he was awaiting trial for the alleged attempted military coup against the Albert Margai administration earlier in 1967, was then released from prison by Andrew Juxon Smith, and he was posted to a diplomatic position with the Sierra Leone Embassy in the United States. Siaka Stevens and Albert Margai were released from detention, and Siaka Stevens was allowed in September 1967 to proceed to Britain for medical treatment. He instead went to Guinea to train his political thugs and mercenaries in neighboring Guinea in order to overthrow the military regime in Sierra Leone, as he believed he was the winner of the 1967 election, and that he had been robbed of victory by the 1967 coup led by Brigadier David Lansana. While in Guinea, he called on Sierra Leoneans not to cooperate with the military government, which he accused of having violated the constitution and trying to replace the ballot box with guns and bayonets. The neighboring states of Guinea and Liberia did not welcome the coup in neighboring Sierra Leone, fearing that it might have an unsettling effect on their armies. While John Amadou Bangura was in the United States, Siaka Stevens negotiated with him to leave his post and join him in Guinea in order to train his political thugs and mercenaries. Colonel John Amadou Bangura mysteriously disappeared from his diplomatic post in the United States when Siaka Stevens in Guinea. Guinean President Ahmed Sékou Touré, who was not in support of the military regime in neighboring Sierra Leone, enabled Siaka Stevens and Colonel John Amadou Bangura to train guerrillas with the purpose of invading Sierra Leone to seize power from the NRC by force of arms. The thousands of young Sierra Leoneans who slipped through the border were trained in self-defense tactics and the use of weapons. When the NRC was delaying to return the country to civilian rule, civil society, professional bodies, and the then vibrant media began advocating seriously. Warrant Officer Patrick Conte, and Sergeant Major Imadu Rogers led the rank and file of the army in a sergeant coup on 18 April 1968 under the Anti-Corruption Revolutionary Movement (ACRM). They imprisoned all senior members of the NRC, including Andrew Jackson Smith, who was the leader of the NRC. The newly formed ACRM then invited Colonel John Amadou Bangura and Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Genda to return to Sierra Leone to head the ACRM. Colonel John Amadou Bangura, who was already in Guinea, just crossed over to Sierra Leone and took over the leadership of the ACRM. He then dissolved the ACRM and formed an interim administration known as the National Interim Council, NIC. A retired police officer, Malcolm Parker, became his deputy. The NIC soon made arrangements for the return to civilian rule. Colonel John Amadou Bangura then invited Siaka Stevens to return to Sierra Leone and hold the position of Prime Minister. Colonel John Amadou Bangura was head of state until 26 April, when he handed over power to Siaka Stevens, who was resworn as Prime Minister. At the same time, the Constitution of Sierra Leone was restored, with Siaka Stevens being asked to form a national government. With the military itself having put an end to military rule, there was a feeling that constitutional government had come to stay. On Sierra Leone's century, Guinea Radio welcomed the return to Sierra. To maintain the support of the military, Siaka Stevens appointed the popular John Amadou Bangura as force commander. Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Genda was made deputy force commander. However, within a year, Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Genda was dismissed from the army and was succeeded by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Saidu Momo as deputy force commander, while he, Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Genda, was sent to serve as High Commissioner to Britain. In 1969, John Amadou Bangura was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. John Amadou Bangura's popularity became a potent threat to Siaka Stevens. The army was devoted to him, and it was believed in some quarters that this made it potentially dangerous to Stevens. Siaka Stevens had campaigned on a platform of socialist principles. However, when he became Prime Minister, he abandoned his pre-election promises and employed an authoritarian method of governance. Siaka Stevens pursued a vigorous policy of consolidating his political hold on the country. The national government, which was formed on return to civilian rule and included SLPP members, soon ran into problems. Soon, election petitions were taken out against successful SLPP candidates in the previous election. Within a month of the establishment of the national government, 27 petitions had been filed by defeated APC candidates, including 2 against Prime Minister Albert Margai, who had led the country. By the end of July 1968, 20 SLPP seats were declared vacant by the courts, and a very violent by-elections were conducted, which resulted in many casualties. As a result of the violence, some by-elections in the south and eastern part of the country were postponed. Calm was not completely restored, and in November 1968, Siaka Stevens declared a state of emergency after disturbances in the provinces. As the police could not contain the wave of political violence, the army was called out to assist in maintaining law and order. The use of the army to quell political disturbances provoked criticisms of the force as a willing tool of the Siaka Stevens government. Besides using the army to deal with the disturbances, the government deployed troops along with police to counter a wave of violent crimes of armed robbery in Freetown. Siaka Stevens embarked on doing worse things that he accused former Prime Minister Albert Margai of, which includes extravagant expenditure of public funds, and this did not go down well with the intellectual within his own political party, the APC. As a result, some of his ministers tried to advise him about the reckless spending and other bad governance practices, but yet still he continued to do the worst. His leadership thus lost the intellectual old guards who had provided so much of the fire against former Prime Minister Albert Margai. This prompted some of his ministers to resign from the government in 1970 in protest against rampant corruption, in order to form a new political party. Siaka Stevens immediately declared a state of emergency throughout the country and announced the banning of the new political party and detained some of its leaders. Siaka Stevens set up a constitutional review commission in late 1969 to early 1970. At the time, Sierra Leone was among the Commonwealth African states in that it remained a dominion with the Queen as a formal head of state. During this period of review, whether Sierra Leone would adopt an executive or ceremonial presidency was under question, and opposition groups were concerned that Stevens was aiming for an executive presidency, which would make him unaccountable to the cabinet. As a result, many senior officers in the Sierra Leone military were greatly disappointed with Siaka Stevens' policies, but none could openly confront him. The force commander, Brigadier John Amagura, who had reinstated Siaka Stevens as Prime Minister, was widely considered the only person who could put the brakes on Siaka Stevens. Brigadier John Amadu Bangura tried to advise Siaka Stevens, but he ignored and instead told the force commander to focus on his job as force commander and that he should stay out of politics, as politics is for politicians. By the early 70s, there were signs of cracks in the relationship between Siaka Stevens and Brigadier John Amadu Bangura, and whereupon some officers were urging Brigadier John Amadu Bangura to unseat Siaka Stevens. The mistake, however, that proved very costly was that the Brigadier John Amadu Bangura and his legal wife Regina were locked in an immortal conflict, apparently over John Amadu Bangura's relationship with another lady, Jamila. Officers unconcerned of Regina's presence took upon openly discussing the overthrow of Siaka Stevens. It is reported that Regina passed on the intelligence to an army officer, Ahmed Thoronka, who in turn brought it to the attention of Colonel Joseph Saidu Momo, who was second in command of the army, and in no time Siaka Stevens got wind of John Amadu Bangura's plot to overthrow him. They infiltrated John Amadu Bangura's security detail by planting spies on him, who carefully monitored his activities and reported to them. Meanwhile, Brigadier John Amadu Bangura on his side was able to recruit top military figures like Major Jawara, Major S.E. Momo, Major Noah, Lieutenant Kolugbonda, and others in the conspiracy to dislodge Siaka Stevens from power. However, by the time Brigadier John Amadu Bangura made his moves against Siaka Stevens, it was too late because Siaka Stevens had his own counterplans against him. On March 23, 1971, on orders from the force commander Brigadier John Amadu Bangura, at about 1:30 a.m., Major Jawara led a group of soldiers who attacked Siaka Stevens' residence and gained entrance to the compound on the pretext that they were on a routine check. Suddenly, they opened fire on the residence, riddling the area with bullets. Siaka Stevens' guards returned the fire, and two of the invaders were killed as they tried to enter Siaka Stevens' bedroom and lounge. The invaders then retired. Siaka Stevens then left his residence to seek shelter elsewhere. In the morning hours, a few of Siaka Stevens' ministers and the APC party loyalists had been arrested and taken to the Wilberforce barracks in Freetown. At about midday, while Siaka Stevens met with some of his ministers in his office in central Freetown, another group of soldiers attacked his office. For some hours, troops loyal to Siaka Stevens engaged the mutineers in a gun battle that left the building badly damaged. At about 3 p.m., the Army's number 3-man, Lieutenant Colonel Sam King, went over the national radio and introduced the force commander, Brigadier John Amadu Bangura.
Fellow citizens, this is Lieutenant Colonel S.H. King speaking. There is going to be an important announcement by the Army Commander, Brigadier J.A. Bangura.
Lieutenant Colonel Sam King's statement was followed by a broadcast message from the force commander, Brigadier John Amadu Bangura. In Brigadier John Amadu Bangura's broadcast, he announced that the army had decided to take over in a view of the current situation, and he promised to make a comprehensive statement which had the full backing and support of all members of the Sierra Leone Armed Forces.
Fellow citizens, owing to the current state of affairs, the Army has been compelled to take control of the situation until further notice. A comprehensive statement will be made as soon as possible. This statement has the full backing and support of all members of the armed forces. Any undue outside interference will be viewed with disdain.
However, the most senior officers next to Brigadier John Amadu Bangura were working on a counter-offensive designed to frustrate Brigadier John Amadu Bangura's efforts to set up a military government. This operation was led by the Deputy Force Commander Colonel Joseph Saidu Momo and Lieutenant Colonel Sam King, who had earlier introduced Brigadier John Amadu Bangura over the radio. The success of the counter-operation was assured when at about 8 p.m. the same day, Lieutenant Colonel Sam King again went over the national radio and announced that a large percentage of the Sierra Leone armed forces wished to disassociate themselves from Brigadier John Amadu Bangura's announcement, and that they still regarded the Siaka Stevens government as the legally constituted authority of Sierra Leone.
And Colonel S.H. We will recall that an announcement dismissing the government from office was made by the Army Commander this afternoon. We wish to assure all in Sunday that a large percentage of members of the Royal Sierra Leone Military Forces will protect themselves from the adoption of this decision by the Army Commander. We therefore regard the present government as the legally constituted authority in Sierra Leone. Thank you.
The next day, which was on March 24, 1971, another broadcast by another officer, Major Tom Colker, was heard over the radio, confirming that Sam King's statement was true and correct. Major Tom Colker broadcasts was followed at about 11:15 a.m. the same morning by a speech from Siaka Stevens, in which he described the assassination attempt and concluded by assuring the nation that the situation was under control.
As the Prime Minister speaking to Will Freetown, I am still alive and healthy by the grace of God. As you all know, things have returned to normal again, and everything is under control. It is a pity that it is hard to pass through these difficulties. But I want to assure you that things could have got very much worse were it not for the help of Providence. Everything is now under control, and I appeal to all to go about their normal duties. The government is determined to fulfill its responsibility to safeguard life and the property. As I have said in one or two cases before, eternal vigilance is the price we have to pay for liberty. And it is up to all of us to be vigilant and watchful if we would want to safeguard our liberties and the liberties of our children.
That was the Prime Minister, Dr. Siaka Stevens, with a broadcast message to the nation.
In the evening of the same day, Siaka Stevens made another broadcast in which he thanked the officers and men of the military forces who remained loyal to his government.
My dear people, this is your humble servant, the Prime Minister, Siaka Stevens, speaking to you. This is my second talk to you since the present crisis began nearly 2 days ago. First of all, I should like to thank the officers and men of the military forces who have remained loyal to the government and who have done so much to bring the present difficulties to a solution. It is for all of us, civilians, to give every possible help and encouragement to these our military brothers in their difficult task. It is also our duty to bring to the notice of the authorities any person or forces who by word or deed attempt to stir up dissension and conflict in our midst. Both as civilians and soldiers, to do everything possible to see that calm is restored, so that the men can go about their work, the women about their business, and our boys and girls can continue to go to school. Let us tackle the present crisis with zeal. Sierra Leone belongs to all of us. Let us put the nation's interest before everything else. God bless you.
By March 26th and March 27th, 1971, Brigadier John Amadu Bangura and few other officers had been arrested and detained. After the abortive coup, Siaka Stevens lost confidence in the Sierra Leone armed forces and decided to bring in Guinean soldiers to consolidate his position and, according to him, to restore law and order. So he requested to Guinean President Ahmed Sékou Touré for Guinean soldiers to be stationed in Sierra Leone to help protect the government. On the 28th March 1971, Siaka Stevens made another broadcast in which he announced that he had signed a defense agreement with neighboring Guinea. He also announces that the armed forces of both Sierra Leone and Guinea have become one and ready to pursue all those who might attempt against peace and security in the two countries.
My dear compatriots, fellow citizens, brothers and sisters of Sierra Leone, our beloved country, Sierra Leone, has faced quite recently a crucial moment in our history. As you know, a group of soldiers, led by ambition and greed, tried to upset the constitutional regime which Sierra Leone has rightfully and freely chosen. In doing so, this group of soldiers and officers, together with a bunch of abominated politicians, wanted to introduce violence and anarchy in the country. What did they want? To confiscate and retain the government power in order to show that brutal force prevails over reason and common sense. A coup d'etat means plain illegality. For nowhere in the Constitution is it stated that a group of men should substitute themselves for the true representatives of the people, the guardians of sovereignty. My dear countrymen and women, as you know, Parliament has voted full powers to the government, which I have the privilege to lead. It is clear, therefore, that all those who have tried to trample down the legal regime are outlawed. As the Prime Minister of the country, who holds his functions from the will of the Sierra Leone people at home, and who freely and lawfully appointed me, I will defend legality by all means, at any moment and in any circumstance. I know I can rely on the support of all friendly African states and that of all other states in the world to safeguard legality in Sierra Leone. But my first help, my first support comes truly from the people of Sierra Leone itself. In these conditions, I will not permit and I will never tolerate, without forsaking my duties as the Prime Minister, that a clique of men without mandate should assume power. Brothers and sisters of Sierra Leone, dear compatriots, I declare solemnly today that I would rather die for my country than accept that a bunch of people should try to govern this country by force. I know I have the great majority of the people and of the army on my side, and that they are faithful and loyal to me. I hail them. As I have already mentioned, I have received full powers from Parliament. These full powers, I urge every Sierra Leone citizen to use them for our benefit so that we restore law, justice, and reason over rude force. People of Sierra Leone, last November, our sister country, the Republic of Guinea, was addressed. On this occasion, the people of Guinea stood as one man to safeguard her sovereignty. This victory, which Guinea achieved, the people of Sierra Leone can also achieve it over troublemongers of every kind. Since the last OAU meeting in Lagos, which dealt with the aggression against Guinea, a problem has arisen, which has been discussed. It is that of organizing the common defense of Africa by the very Africans. For this reason, the government of Sierra Leone submitted to both the government of Liberia and Guinea a project of the Common Defense Treaty. The three countries have agreed in principle on the subject. But due to the serious events which took place in our country, the government of Sierra Leone, through its Prime Minister, and the government of the Republic of Guinea, through its President, have signed the treaty. We are sure that within a short time, the government of our sister country of Liberia will join Sierra Leone and Guinea. Fellow countrymen, so I have the great honor and the privilege of solemnly announcing to you that from this very moment, the armed forces of both Guinea and Sierra Leone have become one, are ready to crush all those who might attempt against peace and security in our two countries. People of Sierra Leone, stand up to defend in unity and concord our sovereign rights and our future. I call upon the workers of Sierra Leone. I call upon the youth and the women of this country to stand united beside the government. I call upon the people of Sierra Leone to crush mightily all enemies of freedom and progress in Sierra Leone. Long live the people of Sierra Leone. Long live African unity.
During the announcement, Guinea troops were flown into Sierra Leone by helicopter. By the end of March, 200 French-speaking Guinea soldiers had arrived in Freetown. They took up positions at Siaka Stevens' residence and office and other key points. They were stationed in Sierra Leone from 1971 to 1973 to help protect the government. In an interview on the 2nd April 1971, Siaka Stevens explained his reasons for calling troops from Guinea.
Came to my mind that the Parliament had in December 1970 passed a resolution following the Guinea invasion. Parliament passed a resolution here to say that we should make a defense pact with Guinea and Liberia. We are a small nation here, we don't have much, and we could take some comfort in linking up with these people in matters of defense so that if anything happened to us, they could come to our help. We had reached agreement with Guinea, and the president of Liberia said he was looking into the matter. So when this trouble arose, tension in the land, the army divided, everybody's nerve on edge, people couldn't sleep for 2 or 3 days. I thought the best course to take was to implement this agreement, this resolution which Parliament had passed in December 1970. I managed to meet President Secretary, and he readily came to our rescue by agreeing to send soldiers over here. The soldiers arrived here on Sunday morning. And since then, there has been some amount of quiet in the place. And I can only hope now that we'll be able to solve these difficulties so that people may be able to live in peace again. Just this morning, a friend of mine was talking to me, and the market women are very, very bitter about what happened. And the morning of the coup, of these 2 attempted coups, a number of soldiers went to the marketplace, shot in the air, and cleared all these people's goods and money that they had. Poor traders, women traders. Those are some of the things that go with these disturbances. And people as a whole here now are happy because they can sleep in peace. For the 2 or 3 days since Tuesday when this thing started till about Saturday, nobody could sleep in this country. They didn't know what was happening. I am very happy to see that things are quieting down now, and we shall do our best to maintain the situation.
On April 19, 1971, Sierra Leone became a republic, and on April 21, 1971, Siaka Stevens became the first executive president of Sierra Leone with wide executive and legislative powers. As soon as Siaka Stevens became president, he had the APC-dominated parliament abolish the right of appeal for court-martial defendants, making the verdict of a court-martial final and not open to challenge in any court. Siaka Stevens then indicted the detained Brigadier John Amadou Bangura and all those connected with the abortive coup. Brigadier John Amadou Bangura was found guilty of treason and was sentenced to death by hanging. While awaiting execution, he wrote a letter to Siaka Stevens pleading for clemency, but Siaka Stevens refused to his request for clemency. He was executed along with Major Jawara, Major S.E. Momo, and Lieutenant Kologbonda on June 29, 1971. The four were the first high-ranking officers to be executed in Sierra Leone after independence in 1961. Sources very close to prison authorities then have it that Brigadier John Amadou Bangura wept on the 11th hour of his execution, finding it hard to believe that Siaka Stevens, the man he handed power to, turned down his plea for mercy. It was also revealed that John Amadou Bangura never faced the gallows. He was beaten to death when he refused to make his last walk to the gallows. Afterwards, concentrated acid was poured on his body, and his body was buried in an undisclosed location under the foundations of a new road. What a terrible way to end for a decorated officer that was held in high esteem. Early in July 1971, the government instituted measures to try other people connected with the abortive coup. John Amadou Bangura's second wife, Jamila, was arraigned before the courts on charges of incitement to commit treason. She was found guilty and sentenced to a 7-year prison term. The future rebel leader, Corporal Fode Sanko, was among those who were tried in July 1971, and he was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his alleged role, as he was alleged to have addressed the mutineers on the morning after the attack on Siaka Stevens' residence. Following the execution of the force commander, Brigadier John Amadou Bangura, Siaka Stevens appointed both Colonel Joseph Saidu Momo and Lieutenant Colonel Sam King as force commander and deputy force commander respectively, as a reward for their loyalty and efforts in putting down the attempted coup of Brigadier John Amadou Bangura. After Siaka Stevens retired from office, he told a reporter that he regretted having John Amadou Bangura killed. Siaka Stevens wrote in his autobiography that for him it was a dreadful act, and that he had to wrench himself out of his own character.